Let me stop for questions. Yeah. Right. So you mean the self of person? Yeah. If you said instantiate person, then itself would point to itself. But inside the object language, we have a special, only for the object language, not for users, version of instantiate that takes another object as argument and makes that the self of the new thing. So what it's doing when you say parent person, it's not doing an ordinary instantiate. It's doing a special kind of instantiate that has gives it a different self. Okay? The way you're supposed to think about it as a user, remember we're looking both above and below the abstraction barrier for object-oriented programming. So I'd like you to understand how object-oriented programming can be implemented, and also like you to understand how to use it. From the user's perspective, that person object doesn't exist. From the user's perspective, piggers just have both kinds of behavior. And piggers just, if there's something in the defined class for pigger, we use that. If not, we use the thing in person. Okay? But from an implementation standpoint, we have chosen to implement inheritance using a method called delegation. You know what delegation means in real life? It's like, I say, write me a 20-page paper about delegation. And you turn to him and say, hey, write me a 20-page paper about delegation. That's what delegation is. You get somebody else to do it. And that's what we're doing here. We are delegating the ask message to this invisible person object. That's not the only way to do it. A lot of object languages don't do it this way. What they do instead is a kind of, it's as if they stick, when you say parent, it sticks the defined class for the person object in front of the defined class for, that you actually wrote for pigger. So you don't actually have a person object. You have one instance. You only have an instance of pigger, but it has built into it both kinds of behavior. That's the other way of doing inheritance. It works fine. It takes more effort than doing it the way we're doing it here, and this way actually is good enough. So in fact, technically, delegation is more powerful if you read the papers than the other kind of sort of inserting the thing in the thing. Okay? Yes? Good question. So the question is, how would you get PP to say, would you please not play games in class without turning it into Pig Latin? You wouldn't. When you define the class, you defined it so that its behavior, the whole point of a pigger, is that it talks in Pig Latin. And it talks in Pig Latin no matter how it's asked to say something. If you wanted it only to speak Pig Latin sometimes, then you would give it two say methods or something, or a say method that takes an extra argument, for how to do it. But that would be complicated because the person thing just calls say. So you'd have to have, for example, you could have an instance variable that you set to true if you want it to speak Pig Latin and false if you don't, and the say method in here could test the value of that variable. So, if you really wanted to do it, you could. But the big point that I'd like you to get is that the whole reason you used a pigger is for it to speak Pig Latin. Okay? Yeah? I'm sorry, say it again? Yeah. It comes from the fact that you used a parent clause. And what the parent clause does is instantiate the parent class, makes an instance, and it gives you a variable. I don't know if it's actually called this or not, but you have a hidden instance variable. And what it's used for, if you think about the way message passing works from last week, it's lambda of message, cond. Is it this message, do this? Is it this message, do this message, do this, else error. Okay? So what we're going to say is, if it's piggle, do this. If it's say, do this. If it's name, because you get free methods for all your variables, then return name. Else, send the message to my person. Okay? That's how it works. Other questions? Yes? Isn't the self an endless loop? No. Well, yes, it's a circular data structure. But where that arrow is pointing is not to the instance variable self, but to the instance, that big box. Okay? This is why, remember when we introduced box and pointer diagrams, one of the things I said was be careful about where the arrowhead is. This is why. Okay? It's not pointing itself. Yeah? Okay, question is, if Pigger didn't have an instantiation variable, what would we do about, in the parent clause, the fact that person does take an instance variable? Well, if you didn't have an instantiation variable for name, it would mean that you want all your Piggers to have the same name. You might want that, in which case, up here, instead of person name, you would say person, quote, Porky. You have to put something. You're the class designer, you decide. Okay?